I was told that at 7 o'clock it's trivia. And so if you showed up for trivia right now, you are going to be acing the category on housing, you're going to be acing the category in incremental development, and you're going to be acing the category on what the heck is wrong with our places. And so welcome, and just a reminder, an encouragement, there's a drinks minimum or an encouragement to make sure that you support a local business here that is hosting us this evening with thanks to them for their support. And don't feel bad at all if you have to step away. We are planning to do a quick recording just to make sure that that's available for everyone as we participate in this together. But as Solly said, my name is Norm and I'm a renter, which in some parts of our communities means that I have no voice. And in other parts of the community means that I am considered to be one of those radicals that's got a pitchfork and is ready to come after everyone. And I'm kind of neither. I do have a voice, and I do believe that as we continue to build stronger communities, there will be more room, more space for everyone within the places that we've built. But we've got a long ways to go to get there. At the start of the month, my wife and I just moved into a new place, and we are renting significantly less in the suburbs of Vancouver for $500 more a month, and significantly more anxiety and stress just because of the challenges that we face in not seeing options being available to us. And so I'm so glad that you've come, because the prevailing pattern of development that we've adopted across North America is making our cities and towns weak and fragile. And we, that is this big we, a movement of people that care about these issues, is trying to change that. And we're doing so from the bottom up. We're doing so in community after community, really being seized by the realization that we have to do this in place after place after place to demonstrate that change is possible, and to actually figure out what that change needs to look like at the local level, rather than trying to do so through top-down strategies that only continue to fail us further. And so the question tonight, in the time that we have, pardon me, followed by time for Q&A as well, is what do we do to provide housing in places where it's become scarce, expensive, and hotly contested? And Santa Barbara is high on that list of places where this applies. I'm always fascinated by the communities that have an abundance of vacant lots. I'm always like, man, that would be nice. There is a challenge that we live in a place of strangling exclusion. Where the noose is getting tighter and tighter and tighter for so many, and the threshold of what it takes to qualify, what it takes to be housing secure, continues to rise and rise and rise. And this has significant consequences in terms of the way that we live our lives and the way in which we struggle in our places. And so, as Solly mentioned, a book was just released this spring. I'm not here to sell books. I'm here to share a message and have a conversation with you. But if you're interested in what we talk about and interested in the ideas being presented, much of it is emerging out of this book by Chuck Marohn and Daniel Harrigus called Escaping the Housing Trap. And I want to highlight, if you can see in the thing, it says the Strong Towns Response to the Housing Crisis. And just as a preview and sort of expectation setting even for this talk, is the publisher came back to them and they said, hey, like, response sounds like you're sort of realizing there's more to be said here. We've got a ways to go on this. How about the Strong Towns solution to the housing crisis? And we said, we can't use that word. There's no silver bullet. There's no singular solution or even like a single set of core solutions that will solve the crisis that we are in. Instead, we need to respond to it. We need to adapt to the creation of our systems that we are now dealing with the consequences of. And so in one way, we could say that we are just trying to make things a little less worse. What did you go out tonight to hear somebody say? That there is a strategy for making things just suck a little less. But isn't that the reality in a situation where we have these escalating tensions, escalating fights over scarce resources, and we're going to struggle in this context? And this is where we are leading a national campaign, and actually it's an international campaign, as we have people across the world. We have 2,500 people that have signed up to lead local conversations like Strong Town Santa Barbara in Pakistan, in Romania, in Cambodia, all over the world, as well as in the United States and Canada, where the vast majority of our groups are emerging. And it's in this context where we're striving for a core principle that the next increment of development should be allowed by right in every neighborhood in America. That means that in each place, in existing neighborhoods, that more housing would be emerging, not rampantly, not aggressively, not all of a sudden, all at once, but instead emerging in response to local need as the conditions allow. And there are so many ways for us to make this happen. There are so many ways for us to allow for the next increment of housing. So if you have a single detached house, that it becomes a duplex or a small set of townhouses. If you have a duplex, it becomes the nearest walk-up apartment. You have various types of housings, and that there is this natural sort of evolution of housing stock within our cities. Instead, what we've done, much like a teenager trying to conceal their face, we create the conditions for a massive eruption of a pimple. Again, you didn't come tonight to talk about skin. Pimples or volcanoes suffer from the same problem. When you allow that pressure to build, then you get this eruption, this trouble. And this is the challenge that we see some of our neighborhoods changing so radically, so quickly. Because all of a sudden, eruption of density, eruption of housing units suddenly just pierces into the community, and the results are really unsettling for a lot of folks. And we can be unhappy that people feel unhappy about more housing, but the reality is there's something core, there's something visceral to this, and there's a path forward in helping many more people to realize as we need more housing in our communities, we can actually provide this without drastically, abruptly changing our communities as we go. Because we're in this situation, as I said, a prevailing pattern of development has made us weak and fragile. And it's a system that has unwittingly trapped us in a path that is leading us to a system that is incapable of building lasting prosperity. I'm going to outline that in a while in terms of the retail sector or the commercial sector, the way in which we build wealth within our communities, as well as build and provide the conditions for prosperity. I would say I could do the exact same numbers with residential, but then I'd get run out of town because people would be like, hey, you're talking about my house. I don't want you to be pointing out that my house is not contributing as much on a per acre basis as everybody in my neighborhood or in the neighborhoods that I think are less deserving in my community and yet financially outperform my Tony Enclave or whatever it might be. And this is, so I say that just to preview where we're going, but it emerges with this core conviction that local and iterative changes are the best approach to gradually create and sustain local prosperity. There is a lot of work being done at the state level. The province of British Columbia, where I live, just recently passed a very impressive suite of housing policy changes, allowing up to 4 units per parcel, making very significant steps forward to allow some really progressive, you could say, or really useful tools. But much of the time, what we need is a state-level initiative and state-level efforts to remove barriers, to remove barricades, without necessarily dictating or sort of laying out exactly what is going to be required or built in particular sites or locations. Because our core principle is that as we adapt in our communities, we need to really recognize that no neighborhood should be subject to radical change, but simultaneously no neighborhood should be exempt from change. And we see both of these rules being violated all over the place. Much of the places is the latter, that they have been exempted from change. They are built. We have the phrase, I just heard it tonight, which was said in an appropriate way, that we are built out. But many people, when they say we are built out, means we're full, we're done, we've basically hit our peak. There is no more room here, move on to the next town. That is incompatible with what it takes to build and sustain enduring prosperity in our communities. And so as we think of being in a trap, none of us like the thought of that. If you're claustrophobic, you're especially freaking out right now. And so in this context, I want to touch on what it means by use of an analogy with an agriculture trap. The idea of the agriculture trap, if you read Noah Yuval Harari and others, have done a great job of saying, like, when there was our society or our ancestors were hunter-gatherers, in that conditions, they had to move with their food, they had to follow it, they had to pursue. There was a lot of movement, there was a lot of unsettledness. You could provide for a community, but it often came at some cost when you were gored by a bison or when you fell afoul of some rodent or whatever it is that occurred, that you were in this battle of tooth and claw in order to sustain yourself and your community. And so some chap said, hey, I noticed that if I actually cultivate a little bit of the bushes around here, we get more berries. And if I put something in the ground that I noticed was growing well over there, and I really make an effort, I can do agriculture. begin to cultivate, begin to irrigate, and begin to establish settlements that began to persist in doing the work of agriculture. And the consequence of this is really clear. We began to grow a lot more food, and hunter-gatherer societies began to give way to agricultural societies. And as a result of this evolution or this adaptation to local opportunities to create food and also sustain a slightly larger population, the result was the need to create more food as well as the availability to do that work of creating that food. But it was beginning to ratchet up, in a sense, the distance or create a distance between the type of population you can sustain with a hunter-gatherer lifestyle versus the type of population that you can sustain with an agricultural lifestyle. And so in an agricultural lifestyle, it is possible to have larger populations, but you can't go back without significantly culling your population, without significant loss of population to get back to sustainable levels. And this is akin to the trap that we've set for ourselves in the housing sector as well. That we have created the conditions through the reliance on increasing prices, increasing use of housing as a tool of investment, as a tool of pension funding yourself, as a tool of securing your future, that we've actually created the conditions for us to be caught in a trap where we are stuck. We cannot go back to a situation when housing was significantly cheaper and more affordable, because that will wreck our economy. It will cause collapse in so many people's lives. But at the same time, we're stuck because a growing number of people are profoundly struggling and a greater number are joining them soon. And how did we get here is the key question. What did the corresponding sort of move from being hunter-gatherers to agriculture, what did that look like in an unprecedented way across the United States and Canada, and as it was smuggled into other places as well, in other communities? The core element that we've laid out in the Strong Towns book and in our lectures as we talk about this is that we took an approach of building cities that had been honed over thousands and thousands of years as establishing successful cities, successful places for people to gather. We took what it took to build those things, which was to embrace complexity, to allow for messiness, to have aspects of chaos woven into the very fabric of our communities. Look at the top-down street grids of many of our older cities, older settlements, and you notice they're not ordered, they're not structured. They may have a grid more recently, but before that time, even still, there was always deviations from the grid. There was always these unique, odd things that now we love, and we're like, whoa, that's my favorite part of the city, or that's the most interesting part, or that's the thing that provides the opportunity for someone to open a little speakeasy in a back alley. The very thing that we have turned back from in the way that we build the vast majority of our communities these days. We traded complexity and adaptability for growth and predictability. This took the form of policies, of subsidies, a whole flurry of construction being done in very replicable ways, almost houses coming off an assembly line. So that we could have a dramatically simplified method of building out our cities, which at Strong Towns we call the suburban experiment. We took that which was complex, our cities and settlements, the establishment of good human habitat, and we said, oh, we can do one better. We can make it more machine-like. We can make it very predictable. We can make it very financeable, because every house in the neighborhood is going to be aging at the exact same rate. Every house, so long as they're not having a dishwasher leak, is going to be worth roughly the same amount of value. It becomes a very predictable type of tool that we have to create complicated, yes, neighborhoods. To every member, if you have had any interaction with city staff or if you work in City Hall, you know cities are complicated. But we have lost the ability to actually embrace that they also need to allow for that complexity, that really deeply woven sense that, like, not everything is going to be square. This can be the challenge that we have, that a new subdivision proposal for 300 houses sails through because it meets all of the requirements, has already met the requirements in Scottsdale, has met them in Philadelphia, and now is being applied here. And yet simultaneously, when you ask to put a cidery above the garage in your backyard, you walk in and they think you are trying to sabotage their process. You are trying to deliberately go out of your way to make things complicated. Or we have an architect who's like, I just want to build great things. things in curious ways, and that defies the very systems of predictability that are complicated. Sure, you have to go through all sorts of criteria, but they are predictable. There's a logical flow to them. There's an absence of messiness, and this is actually a key part of the reason why we've gotten into the trouble that we're in. This is, you probably won't be able to guess, an older city. From the 1870s. It's Grand Rapids, Michigan, in case you're a GeoGuessr. But I want to point out a couple of things here. Notice the mix of sizes and uses within an emerging city. As they're adapting to local pressures, local needs that were emerging in these places, you have a lot of complexity. There's a whole lot of effort made to use scarce land. So as you get closer to the downtown core, you have full lot coverage. People are saying, if I buy it, I'm going to use it. I'm not going to be setting aside a significant side yard in order to make sure that I'm not too close to my neighbor. No, I'm going to be right up against them and up to the street where all the activity is. I'm going to be able to adapt and develop my structures. You see in the little bottom here, there's a little shed that's been wedged in between other structures. Yeah, it's a little bit chaotic, it's a little messy, but it's actually part of adapting for Uncle Bill, who decided to move from Ukraine. And you're like, well, we got to find a place for him somewhere. And so we don't want him by the kids because he's a grump, that's why. And so we're just going to make sure he's got his own space. And we said, whoa, 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 whoa. In fact, if you go back into the literature, that's immigrant culture. And this is part of the challenge that we have, is that in this context, our city leaders began to say, let's do the things that create very predictable, class-based structures that maintain a certain hierarchy and maintain the things that we need in our communities. And when we do this, then we will be rich. Then we will be known as the city that everyone else wants to emulate. Now, if you look at this type of settlement pattern, this type of traditional development pattern, we can see this in virtually every one of our downtown cores, in the places that we can go, not just here in North America, but go elsewhere as well. And you'll continue to see these things. But one of the challenges that the United States faced head on in the dirty 30s was the Great Depression. And in that time, one of the biggest things in the crosshairs was the fact that houses were soon going to be worth virtually nothing. And the reason they were becoming virtually worthless is because you had too many people trying to sell what little they had in order to meet the obligations that they owed to the banks. And there were so few buyers, and those buyers were not motivated, if they had cash, to buy Bill's house for $20 if they knew that in 5 weeks it would be even less than that. So you have buyers sitting on the sidelines. If they have cash, they're just waiting because they know that the price is going to continue to decline as the flood of houses comes back onto the market that are just being fire auctioned off. And simultaneously, you have this growing housing shortage, you have a growing need, you have a growing social problem. And so the federal government stepped in and said, we got to arrest this problem. We need to keep people in their houses. And the way that we do that is we tell the banks, we will backstop all of the loans that are being provided to you, and we will basically broker an arrangement that these people are going to continue to pay you even over a longer period of time. This is the genesis of longer term mortgages with fewer balloon payments, fewer obligations to come up with money up front. You were able to basically ride it out, and as a result of this actually began to spark even opportunities for new housing construction. And so this tool to open up the pockets for local homeowners to be able to stay in their homes, as Franklin Roosevelt said, we have taken a step toward the ending of deflation, that is that spiral downwards as prices fall, which was rapidly depriving many millions of farm and homeowners from the title and equity to their property. He said, we've stopped it. And that seems good. I'm glad. Probably there were people there might be a few people still alive today that would be appreciative of this. But then something else happened. World War II came on the scene, and it was a significant jolt to the system. There was a lot of economic activity all of a sudden. It was not the only reason that the Great Depression ended, but certainly didn't help, certainly helped. But as the war was beginning to sort of move into its more mature phase, already in the early 1940s, there was a recognition that the Allied forces, barring some significant abrupt change, were going to win. And in this context, they were faced with a challenge that if the war were to end, there would be a sudden rapid demobilization of all the troops coming back over, as well as the closing of all these factories or the repurposing of these factories that no longer were needed to produce jeeps and armaments and things like this. And the question was, how do we avoid sliding right back into the same deflationary cycle that we were previously in? We'll have unemployed people coming back, and we won't have sufficient work for them, which are the two causes of most revolutions. Unemployed people with too much time on their hands and nothing for them to be able to spend what little they have on as prices continue to run away from what little that they have available to them. And so in this context, the decision maker said, were the war to end suddenly, we would enter into the largest unemployment and industrial dislocation which any economy has ever faced. This is Paul Samuelson, one of the chief economists. And so as a result, they said, well, we did something with housing that arrested a decline, that stopped a decline. What if we use those same tools and use it to juice our economy? Basically, use it to put people to work and use it to rapidly deploy resources that previously were building armaments and now put them into building the things that we need, which is let's build settlements. Let's build brand new settlements. Let's do this en masse. Let's do this much like the assembly line improved that you can pump out tanks. Let's do this with housing as well. And the effort was made to make it easier for more people to borrow more money. Again, that was one of the key things during the Great Depression. They said, let's just make it that more people can borrow more money, because then that creates a larger pool of buyers. So if we make it easier for more people to borrow more money, they can actually pay more for housing, which stopped the deflationary spiral of housing prices. But now when you begin to rely upon that as your tool to begin to spike your economy, to be able to return it to a growth cycle, the question is, how do you get off that train? How do you stop this? And this is our key point at which the move, you could say, from hunter-gathering, following after bison in sort of a traditional way, to now doing it in a very different way occurred. Making it so much easier through a lending term that was increased, through land opening up post-war with assurances that we will provide services to these places. Think of your post-war neighborhoods, and they're built out and they begin to receive all of the wonderful things that come with living in a city context, as well as the deterrence of alternatives. So many of the efforts made to redline communities, not provide lending to them, as well as the inability of many places to allow for the redevelopment of existing housing stock, allowing so many of these things which suffered from a lack of maintenance during the wars, and yet were not themselves the prime economic targets for all of the natural revitalization work that would have naturally taken place if the alternative had not been so juicy, so subsidized, and so so present. And then a third key factor was highway spending that was now uncoupled from local budgets. This is particularly with the Interstate Act, when all of a sudden you begin to see that you can have a highway, you can have a highway, you can have a highway, instead of it being tied to the local economic conditions, which would merit or demerit any kind of investment in these types of things. And the results of this were staggering. This is Leviton, New York. Here you can see that complicated but very sort of structured system of pumping out house after house after house with significant setbacks, really in its early infancy, beginning to be perfected here. You can see also that in the traditional development pattern, this type of distributed settlement pattern would over time begin to thicken up. Remember that slide of Grand Rapids that I would show you? This might look, in some with a little less predictability, it would look a lot like what used to be there maybe 50 years prior in Grand Rapids. But over time, the city would thicken up. The city would respond to local need and develop horizontally, yes, somewhat, but mainly vertically, more intensive land use. You would fill in the gaps before you would go and colonize more space. And so in this context, you can see that we've substituted a very organic system for something that is much more complicated, very subsidized, and very structured. And it was an exceptional growth machine. The United States ended up being the dominant, powerful force, in part because they didn't have to rebuild bombed ruins or recover from wartime consequences, but also because there was this massive profusion of cash just flowing through the system as you take a green field and you plunk rows and rows of houses upon it. Just north of here, we've got Fresno, California. I'd love to do this map in Santa Barbara as well, but your conditions are a little bit different given that you're bounded by the hills and things like this. But actually, we'll see. I'll show you the annexation map in just a moment here. But this is a picture of like how did the city of Fresno maintain the land that it had, and how much of its land base did it have in various decades. And so if you're in 1897 initial settlement stage on the West Coast within the Fresno community, by 1909, so a number of years go by, the population is growing, is increasing, but the general relative land base is not growing all that much. By 1922, so they're heading into the roaring 20s, they're on their way, and yes, there is new developments being built, but much of that activity, if we had sort of a density map, an intensity map, would actually be in the areas of most optimal investment, which is still in that core. Think of the spaces here that are date around that time. Some of our best infrastructures from the 1920s, 1910s in these situations. Even in the midst of the dirty 30s, you have, by 1934, they're still continuing to develop, but as they do that, they're intensifying their land use, using rare resources well, rather than continuing to consume more and more and more. By 1946, you've made it through a war, and you still see there are new neighborhoods being constructed, but it's not at the scale and this pace that we begin to see in 1958, into 1970, 1983, 1995, 2010. And if we continued, it would continue on beyond that. I was just in Santa Clarita, and their map from 1987 just goes, they have the map by 2024. It's just continued to blossom, continue to bloom. And doing this would be fine if it didn't mess with the core functioning of our communities. This is Santa Barbara. This is a poor, one, I learned about your airport. That is very interesting. Wow. That is one of the most creative uses of map making that I've ever seen. And the fact that the vast majority of the annexed territory is in the Pacific Ocean just like made me laugh in a public library today. But it is a story of a gradual outward expansion and then a much more rapid and ultimately, we would say, an unsustainable expansion at the cost of long-term prosperity in the communities. This is from our partners at Urban 3. They did an analysis of the sewer system as it changed over time in the city of Kansas City. So long ways away from here, but the principles still apply. So 1910, 82,000 people lived there. The feet of sewer pipe per person required to provide running toilets, and they did have them in 1910, was 1.1 feet of sewer pipe per person. So imagine if you and Jimmy and a few other people are all using the toilet, you've got a bunch of you that are able to cover the cost of your 1 foot and your 1 foot, and everybody's covering their 1 foot. By 2010, you have a 1.8 increase in the amount of people that live there, but a 27 times increase in the amount of feet of pipe per person. So that suddenly, if little Jimmy is responsible for 30 feet, and you're responsible for 30 feet, and you're responsible for 30 feet. This is a consequence of this type of development pattern, and this was fueled by the suburban expansion, the suburban experiment that has created these conditions. South Bend, Indiana is even more stark. They actually experienced a net population decline of 22% from 1960 to 2020, and yet the number of lift stations required to lift water and sewage increased by 1.3 thousand%, and the number of miles of force main went up by 6,452. In this hilly community, you know what it's like to be able to settle the areas that are easy to settle. And then afterwards, you get more and more projects that are like, well, we could do more on hills. We can do more higher and higher. We can continue to elevate, and yet every foot of elevation requires significant public infrastructure in order to maintain that. The roads are harder to maintain. The poop doesn't go where it should, and the water struggles to get to where it should. You create these conditions for a much more consumptive pattern of living, and in that consequence, we create the conditions of first burning through our cash reserves, then turning to bonds, and then ultimately resulting in insolvency. So we wrote a piece on our website about Santa Clara struggling with insolvency. Houston is struggling with insolvency. Many of our major cities, and actually many of our small ones too, are becoming increasingly functionally insolvent. And it emerges out of the fact that we've lost sight of what it takes to build lasting prosperity. This is a quote from an old builder who called me at Strongtowns. He said, "Is Strongtowns a cult?" I was like, all right, I gotta know, like, what's the behind story of this? And he said, I've been a builder in Wisconsin for decades. And he said, I would do very simple, modest projects for the city, for the county, for local landowners, a modest little structure on the water treatment plant or whatever it looked like. He said, I would do it and they would pay me my cash. And he said, my son took over my business and I was proud of him because he grew the business. But every project he was doing was funded with bonds. It was funded by big grants. It was funded from outside money. It was all of this stuff that he said, I know that we are going to have to keep it up, and yet we can't afford to do it. And he said, we've lost sight of what it takes to build lasting prosperity. And this is a core part of Strong Towns and where we want to continue to change the conversation here. And this is directly tied to our housing development patterns. We talk about the growth Ponzi scheme, and we have a video if you are interested on the financial disaster that this has created for our communities. And just a little longer, I want to touch on what I mean by this distinction of development patterns. Because the suburban experiment is a pattern in development in a suburban style, and it was a radical departure from the traditional development pattern. Now, some of us probably like to gamble. And if you gambled on a certain candidate last night, maybe you made a lot of money and others didn't. But in this context, we can have the situation where you say, hey, let's try something. At Strong Towns, we say, let's make lots of small bets. But what happens if you make a really big bet? You'd better be right. And the big bet that our city builders have made is that if we leave our neighborhoods in perpetual adolescence, that is, don't allow them to grow up, don't allow them to develop, put on a little bit of muscle. My son, we call him kid muscles, he's 9. Amazing, but I don't want him to stay as kid muscles. I want him to grow, I want him to develop and thicken up. And yet we have said, no, let's maintain neighborhoods as they are, for entire neighborhoods to be built out all at once into a finished state. And often in perfect conformity with our zoning standards that we've actually allowed them often to author as they establish these in their community. Meanwhile, a traditional development pattern contains assemblies of increasingly independent neighborhoods. Perhaps you have smaller areas in your neighborhoods where it still has a recognizable name. You can say, hey, meet me in such and such a place, and you know what that place is. And it's not like Grouse Tree, which is the two things that the developer had to kill in order to make it possible to develop there. No, these are defined neighborhoods. These are the thickening up places where you would see, of course, people making a small bet on, hey, I bet I could start a coffee shop here or a bakery. Or I bet if I opened my medical practice here, I would be able to develop a clientele in this space. And yet we, through zoning and other restrictions, have made it virtually impossible for this to happen. Just down in Santa Clarita, I was talking with them, and they said they just put in 1,000 new homes and not a stick of retail in that whole site. They said, how is this possible? How do we have 1,000 people, 1,000 homes means what, 3,000 people, depending on occupancy. And in that context, that's a small town that would have a school, that would have a library, that would have multiple doctors, that would have all of these things. And yet we say in a suburban pattern, they can drive. They can drive to whatever they need. They can drive on the highways that we continue to widen on all of these types of things. And it guts or it limits. It's sort of like taking an antibiotic and killing your gut health. It's stopping the incremental responses to local pressure capitalizing to local pressure, because in a traditional development pattern, you capitalize on proximity. You capitalize on being near. Co-location with other spaces is really critical, and you begin to develop that symbiotic relationship. And you concentrate activity and prosperity building opportunities within these spaces. Now, the traditional development pattern, as I said, is an ongoing adaptation to local pressure. It accepts incremental change and ensures greater financial opportunity. Because we are dealing with strangling exclusion or its corollary, which is rolling blight, and that rolling blight is affecting more and more communities across the United States and Canada, but actually is going to come for some very seemingly prosperous communities at this point. Here, I'll go forward just a little bit into, quickly here, this is on State Street. I want to touch on this, and like I said, I could do this with your houses, but then I would be unpopular, and I don't like that feeling. So let's talk about businesses. Right here on State Street, you have a 0.1 acre site. It's the one, the two-story structure, very simple, very modest. It is performing as a $2.5 million assessed value of that property. If we take it on a per acre basis, it's producing $25.3 million per acre. I grew up on a farm. We would assess the productivity of our land as to how many bushels per acre that we would get. Otherwise, we could just say, well, the big field, we took 18 bales, and the small field, we took 10 bales, and so the big field is better. But if the big field is like 14 times bigger than the small field, then actually the small field is better from the perspective of what it takes to use the amount of inputs we need in order to get a certain number of outputs. And this is the value, this is the prosperity, this is the wealth that is privately held, from which you can then take a fraction to fund and support the things of the commonwealth, the things of the common good, the things of the common purse. Now, I would say it depends on your politics how much of that fraction you want it to be, but we all recognize we need private capacity in order to provide for public luxury and public needs in our communities. And notice, and again, California is a sales tax state, but there is still property tax, and you'll find that this value, this performance of the property taxes is a real good proxy for much of what you see in terms of the sales tax revenues as well. And so $287,000 coming in every year, $1,000 I should say, every year per acre as the tax bill being dropped off from each of these sites. Figueroa Street, 0.12 acres, $22.6 million per acre. So a similar development pattern, missing that second story, but hasn't had a significant effect on its value per acre. Again, a significant healthy contribution to the local tax base. This is 1311 State Street. It's an even smaller site. We can see one of the arguments for fine-grained urbanism. For the idea in the planning world that's becoming more common that no assembly should be required. Use the existing parcel widths, use those sites as they are, and the biggest culprit for why we don't do that is parking requirements, which we'll touch on in a moment. But notice its value just spikes because it's a very concentrated use of that space to generate and radiate wealth into the community, coming in at $484,000 an acre in taxes. But then let's change the development pattern. This is the gold standard of what our predecessor said is the sign that your community has actually made it. This, I mean, we could do without that. This, come on, that's not real. That's not what we put on the brochures. Although now with State Street being the way that it is, I think it might be. But this is what we said is what we need everywhere. This is what the big banks subsidize. This is what our cities would bow and genuflect before the mall developers to say, please, won't you come here? At a 10x decrease in the value that's here. How much do we value the stuff we can buy at Macy's that we're willing to subsidize it at 10 times as much as what we get in these small little stores? Our McDonald's pays 1/7 the amount of property tax that our local coffee shop does. And so I'm always like, how much do we love the delight that is the McGriddle? That we will subsidize it to such an extent. And also, when people say, oh, well, we need big box stores because that's the only place that we can get low prices, how much does this type of tax giveaway, how much of this do we actually cause those low prices to be available for the high-cost retailer and struggle to provide for the one that is actually benefiting the community? Even another change in the development pattern, bringing it even further down. Again, this is not this was a larger site. This is a slightly smaller site, but we're talking a fraction of what the value per acre performance of these other spaces is. And yes, it's the same thing with housing. And what's critical here, I deliberately picked the one site that is the largest, that is the tallest, is the one that is the Macy's that performs the worst. This isn't saying that Santa Barbara needs 40-story towers. Those are your pimples. And yes, you're going to get pimples if you continue to block your skin, or I should talk about volcanoes. If you block the fissures in the rock, you will continue to get volcanoes because the pressure builds, and then you'll get them. And I actually accept that at some point we just need to build some of these significant towers, as well as in our downtowns where you have sufficient height, then it makes sense to do that type of work. Manhattan makes sense for skyscrapers, but we're seeing these weird things where you've got an 8-story tower right next to single-story houses, and it's the only tower that sits there. Like in my city, we have a 20-story tower that has been the only tower on that site for well over 25 years. The city said, sure, and then they said, never again, because they weren't allowing any of the incremental adaptation of the neighborhoods to occur in that context. And so when we change our development pattern, it causes this loss in ability to build lasting prosperity. And I just added, State Street must serve as a platform for building wealth. That is its function. That's why you invest in it. And in order to do that, you actually want to concentrate rather than dilute the wealth building activity that takes place here, which is why this type of a development pattern is most conducive. And anything you can do to actually improve the aesthetic, improve the well-being of people that are here actually will drive up the capacity of these places. In contrast with the IHOP, where because of that shift in the status, there's still a structure, but it's not built to the street. It's not built to concentrate activity. It's built to dilute it by providing the parking as close as possible, and yet diluting the capacity of this site to ever generate anything close to the amount of economic productivity that so many of these very simple, modest structures have. And I do want to point out as well, who can afford the $39 million site? People with $39 million in their pocket. In contrast, who can afford, now who can afford a 2.7 million? Not me, but that brings it a lot closer. And in communities that don't quite have the same sort of aggressive land price calculation factored in, you're seeing some that are real. This is still within reach of many local businesses with mortgages, with the capacity that they have, and yet this is the type of thing that we've made widespread, and we've struggled to actually create the conditions for people to participate in their places. And without that ability to participate in your place, it becomes much more difficult to be invested and participate in these things. Doesn't mean you have to be a property owner in order to have a place in your community, but we do generally want to see more people sharing in the prosperity building opportunities in our communities. Now, and Nassim Taleb says, when we are in a system that is predicated on growing, we are really loath to test, to challenge and challenge it. And so when we think of an anti-fragile system, it's something that becomes stronger as it's tested, as it's put under tension. And therefore, an anti-fragile city is one that is constantly subjected to many small stresses. One is leaders, both civic and private, make small experiments that aren't catastrophic when they fail. And this is our core critique of the idea that entire neighborhoods should be built out all at once to a finished state. Where is the opportunity for experimentation, adaptation, and change? And so what do we have? This is a chart of housing prices over the decades. And the challenge that we have is that complex systems are supposed to be able to correct themselves back to the sort of line of equilibrium, and we've lost that ability. Because of this core element, this core feature, again, this is not news to I would sense, if you're coming on a Wednesday night, it's not news to you that housing as shelter means that all housing types are needed in rapid, fluid response to local needs. And I really want to stress that rapid response. This is a criticism of people when they're, I've heard it in my own house or my own family where they're like, oh yeah, so-and-so, and then I don't even know who all lives in that house. There's a grandmother and a mother and selected, uncles that have showed up. I'm like, that's human culture. That's normal. That's what we do in response to in rapid responses, we make a bed available. We help people in their need. And in this context, change increases opportunities. But when we continue, as my city has done, say, let's reserve 80% of our land for one type of housing, the single detached house. And then we wonder why, if you don't have $1.4 million, you're in a housing crisis. That is the core reason. We have limited change, and therefore we have decreased opportunities. But if housing is your chief investment, it means that predictable financial units are what you want, predicated on persistent scarcity to maximize value, and therefore change threatens the bottom line. And therein lies the deepest of our problems. This is the house price index from 1945 to December 2022. I actually put a little note there because I was like, oh, maybe 2022, the prices were starting to improve. But we have a whole system dedicated to the idea that housing should be expensive. And so in this context, you can see where actually that's a little, this is my little point where I was like, do we have hope? Do we have any kind of a correction? As a renter, I keep praying for a crash. Even though as someone that loves people that are deeply invested, I know that it shouldn't happen. But we had a run up in the 2008s. Then there was the crash. Then we had the recovery, which felt like it was more like recovery as it continued to accelerate. And then we had the 2022 correction, but now we are continuing on. And the core problem is that the consequences, much like what Nassim Taleb, as we talk about failing early, failing often, is actually to be able to buffer yourself against massive downside, massive risk, either of social upheaval or significant financial correction and the challenges that will come from this. But here's our challenge. Who benefits from high house prices? It is staggering to begin to add it up. Local governments, state governments, federal governments, homeowners, banks, developers, contractors, land speculators, realtors, pension funds. On the other side, weighing in at a paltry 110 pounds, are the renters and the poor. But that number keeps growing of renters and poor. And I always joke, and they found pitchforks. They are learning what it is to take to the streets, or learning what it is to foment change, struggling on this account because there are serious vested financial interests. But this is the crisis that we've created for ourselves by continuing to double down on these things. And the reality is, I shared that slide earlier that said if we need housing as shelter, what we need to provide is change as well as rapid and fluid different types of housing types in our communities. And that will be the pattern so that many of these single family homes, they can hold their value. They can hold their value, still be a proxy as someone's pension. They can still be the thing that people will want to hold on to. Although there is a huge question what will happen when seniors begin to retire en masse and begin to move out of them. Will there be a fire sale? I have my doubts. I feel like there will still be intervention to make sure that that doesn't result in significant price corrections. But along the way, we are going to see a challenge where renters are going to face deeper and deeper struggles, and the poor as well. Because the starter house is nearly extinct, we have this article on our site. I can assure you in Santa Barbara, it is definitely dead as a doornail. There is a challenge. You can see in the red are homes that were available for under $250,000. That is across the United States, and it's evaporated. That starter home is now gone. Here's a great line. If we limited Toyota to only build 10,000 cars per year, they would choose to keep the Lexus and scrap the Camry. Even though at volume, they could actually build more Camrys and be more profitable. And that's what we see in the auto industry, but we've done the opposite with housing, and therefore we are getting the outcome of being first in a wobble and then finally ending up in a ditch. And the question is, how long are we going to be here? How long are we going to have to endure this? In the Housing Trap book, again, I'm mindful, good sir over there, of my time. We need three core things that we are calling on local leaders in particular to step up to do, to reform zoning laws. And again, this is because there's a national debate as to what to do. Sometimes that national debate is, hey, let's give every first-time home buyer more money to fuel the increase in housing prices. Let's transfer more wealth. Let's do all of these things. We say first, our local leaders must reform their zoning laws. Do so every council meeting with just small tweaks, one by one by one by one. Remove the requirement that your secondary, your ADUs be a certain size. Say in our city, we now allow them to be as large as the primary dwelling. All of a sudden, you create some really interesting opportunities within existing communities to increase the supply of entry-level housing, foster a community of incremental developers, and use their financing tools. Well, what does this look like? This means lowering the bar of entry. This often means that if you have existing lots within a neighborhood, this even applies here in Santa Barbara, where you're going to have gaps in the development pattern. What my colleague Edward illustrated this. He said, look, with the same amount of public infrastructure, you can return so much of the housing that is needed and double the amount of available support in our populations to be able to provide for the adequate needs of our communities. Accessory dwelling units, we have to start just calling them like backyard cottages, make them less technical, less something that you get on your doctor's bill or your, actually it sounds like a little add-on on your insurance bill. And instead, actually, my other joke is that infill sounds like something you get at the dentist, but it's actually just neighborhood investment, people investing in their neighborhood. It's not, we could call it infill, but that's planner speak. What we really want is that lively activity of people investing in their places. We also need to remove, again, things that I think it's helpful to label these as suburban aversions to complex adaptation, or things that make people think things are getting a little messy. Things are getting a little more chaotic. We actually can be okay with a lot of things happening in our housing lands. If my neighbor buys a large RV and parks it in their driveway, I don't get a say in it. I just get to adapt to it. And guess what? After about 3 minutes, I'm over it. If they get a brand new truck and they take the muffler off, and I can call bylaws about the nuisance, but I can't do anything about the truck. But when it comes to a modest structure in the backyard, we've still made it so difficult for this to happen. And so we need to erase the things that we've done that really are hallmarks of the suburban experiment and really challenge these things. There's the strategic exclusion by class or status, the resistance to change, and the assumption of auto-dependency. You can check so many of the things in your city's comprehensive plan and say, oh, I see where that's coming from. Oh, I see how that fits in. We had regulations on where laundries, public laundries were allowed to be situated. It wasn't because the residents of Delta were so clean and didn't need them. No, it was because Chinese people were the ones that were running them. And so they said, oh, we'll put it there, we'll put it there. Exclusion by class, exclusion by status, and exclusion by race. The assumption of auto-dependency also is, well, where are they going to park? What if we have units that don't require parking, subsidized or affordable housing, where we still have parking requirements strangling these projects and preventing them from going ahead? Legalizing the next increment by right, we say that there should be a minimum amount of regulatory friction to increase housing density by one increment or by one step up. And be a little loose on what that one step up is, but that should just be a natural process that we say you should come in with a ninth grade education at 9 o'clock and leave at noon with your building permit in hand. Our building departments lose their mind at that thought. They're like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, these are the aversions to complex adaptation of existing sites that we need to become familiar with. And so we also have put a challenge before city leaders to say, allow the approval by right of the next increment or seek permission to skip increments. So if you want to go through the slow lane, the contentious lane, the lane that we've established that currently every project has to go through, we will say, go for it. If you want to leave that in place with all of its inefficiencies, with the hours and hours of staff time, the amount of money that gets burned on projects simply by waiting and waiting and waiting for discretionary reviews and caucus or council revolts and letters to the editor, all of that stuff, or take the other path, which might not get you as many units, but will get you there much sooner with much more certainty. And we say, if we allow this, many of our small-scale developers would choose that in a heartbeat. They would say, that's what I've asked for this whole time. I don't know why I have to go through the rigmarole every time I propose even looking at a site to put some housing on it. We need to match transportation goals with housing goals. I love this line. If road expansions incentivize greenfield development, then doing the opposite, creating more walkable places, incentivizes infill or residential in neighborhood investment. And this is something, perhaps you have this if you have your comprehensive plan. Ours has like a great 8 pages of preamble, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is awesome, love it. We're gonna be a great walkable community, we're gonna do all of these things, and then we hit the code, the rules, and I'm like, what is all this? We can show this to the people in our community. Show this to your city leaders to say every time that you tout that you are a climate-friendly place or whatever it is that you have, every new ambition has to be matched with zoning reform, has to be matched with the types of changes that we can do. Eliminating parking minimums, we've got a whole campaign on this. I love this line from the Urbanist that Spokane had ditched their parking. What's up with the rest of everybody? Let's get on this. We need to normalize lending for ADUs. This was something that even California, Los Angeles is leading the way in this, making it much more accessible to be able to get not just a car loan, which you can walk in and walk out in 3 hours or less with that, and you get the pen to go with it, and they'll escort you in and escort you out, but you come to them for a backyard cottage, and it's like, wait a minute. All of the regulations, all of the rules, all of the things, we say, no, it should be so normal. It should be easier to have something that actually produces revenue for you rather than a car loan, which is only a drain on your finances. And so this is a core part of it. If you have minimum lot sizes, and forgive me, I didn't do the research to know if you do or not, at this point, they need to go. If people want to build on a postage stamp, let them. If they did in the past, and things didn't go terribly, let's learn from that pattern. Let's identify that small is beautiful. We need to legalize small. We also need to make the case that small is democratic. Small is bringing more participants into the process. Small is allowing somebody with a tiny checkbook to participate. This is where even the entry of a food truck is an example of how when you legalize small, you create pathways to future ownership of other enterprises, other opportunities in our communities. Again, this is singing from a hymn book, but we need to allow residential and commercial areas. Briefly, I'll say, we often talk about mixed use. I wish we could get rid of the idea of mixed use and embrace the idea of fluid uses. Mixed use is just stacked, segregated uses. And it is still a problem. It is still a prediction that this is the only thing that should occupy this site, is this type of activity, and then everything else should be different, should be something else. It is still exercising not a dictatorial power, it's a legislative power, but it is one that doesn't actually meet the needs that are there. So an example, there are cities that have form-based codes and they require retail on the ground floor. And developers come along and they say, I want to build 4 stories of housing above. I don't know that I'll be able to justify going to the bank and saying I'm going to get some tenants for the retail. We don't have a retail base in this area. Well, say you can make that residential, but at least allow for it to revert at any point without any additional begging before council to turn back into retail. You'll have to meet a different building code. If it's going to be a slaughterhouse, you're going to have to install noise dampening tools and things like you'll have to make it fit, but you should do so as a good business and you should do so to meet code, but not to then have to go and change the use of it. And so the idea of allowing the uses to ebb and flow, this is what we see in our existing neighborhoods. A house that becomes a doctor's office, then the doctor retires and he's like, all right, patients out, it's my house again. That's the type of pattern that we actually should see much more frequently. And then again, as well, we need to see these pockets, these nodes of activity allowed to mature through the allowing of retail and services in residential areas. This is one of those things that is an aversion that so many that are stuck in a suburban mindset still have to the complex adaptation of their places. And we need to remove these aversions. There's so much more. I'm going to just speed through this. We need to grow an ecosystem of local developers. Please check out the Incremental Development Alliance if you haven't already learned of what they are doing. They're fostering ecosystems of small-scale developers, helping them to start a first project, helping them to work with their city, helping them to clear the way and get their first projects done. It's incredible what they're doing, and it's also incredible how many things we do to put in their way. We need to remove the guesswork. I hope your city is already allowed for pre-approved building plans. It's a very modest way of allowing architects. Our architect has left already, so we're not putting her out of work. We're giving her a challenge to create building plans that the city can pre-vet and say, if you build it according to this menu, you will be able to do this routinely. Our beer master has to do that with his pots of beer. He's like, I'm going to follow the recipe, I'm going to make a change, and now I know that I can use that the next time. And yet so many of our housing projects are bespoke. Every time you come in, you have to go through the same process, the same review, the same, what is the shade envelope of that umbrella? And you're like, no, just allow it. It's housing. We need this in our places. More and more places are doing this. And then utilizing financing tools. Muskegon, Michigan, I do want to pause to highlight what they've done. They've used tax increment financing to enable the housing purchase price to be knocked down through the provision of a loan to the homeowner that when they move in, their house, they basically receive a loan that is then returned to the city over time through the incremental tax revenue that comes to them over a series of time. If you're going to do it for the Staples Center, if you're going to do it for an Amazon headquarters, if you're going to do it for billions of dollars in some of these TIFs for some new chips factory, what about if we do this in the tens of thousands for our small homeowners, for people that are looking to get a start? Check it out. Even in a market as hot as Santa Barbara, this actually still can make a measurable difference in bringing new people into home ownership and creating more opportunities. Fund and support contractor training. This is what Kalamazoo is doing. They're pre-development and technical assistance, providing reduced land prices based on affordability. Because we need to think of housing reforms as a series of parallel deadbolts, like a bank safe. And if you unlock one of those doors, like I said, there's no silver bullet. If you unlock one of them, it won't change. But it's when we begin to unlock the vast majority that things can proceed. Only one of those deadbolts is labeled single-family zoning. The others are built form regulations, development fees, development delays, access to financing, cost of construction, skilled labor shortage, development culture, and support networks. And so as I said at the start, we're trying to make things just a little less worse. This is just a picture of the deep, deep embedded challenges that we have, the aversion to complex adaptation of our communities, and yet we can begin to make changes. And so with that, thank you for taking time tonight to chat about this. Let's take time for questions and complaints, rebuttals, and objections, all of this stuff together. But thank you so much for your time. Thank you. You've been wonderful. I think that was about an hour, but we have a little bit of time before trivia starts. I don't know if the Trivia Meisters arrived. No, we're good. All right. Any questions or I would love commentary as well. Definitely dive right in. So the idea of infinite demand is not a fact. I mean, it's not correct. There's significant unmet demand and persistent demand because of sort of being a status community. In Vancouver, where we are, we're a gateway city where there's a lot of people that have identified it as a safe harbor for capital. And so the idea is like there's constantly going to be an influx of more capital that is unanchored or not anchored to local incomes. And as a result, we're going to be subjected to these forces. In that context, one thing is affordable housing then shouldn't be a problem because that's just trying to address the local need that we already currently have. That is the types of things that we can be supporting and subsidizing and making possible and removing many of the regulatory burdens that are currently put on it. But another key part of it is to say that there is no doubt a filtering capacity in our community. We can't change everything all at once, everywhere. But there is clearly a distinction between like sitting on the brakes and like allowing some forward movement. And then another key factor is to also address that much of the current experience that people have of development in their city is actually single-family homes being replaced with single-family homes. They're much bigger than they were. They're much more expensive than they were. And that is certainly, beachfront communities faces that like that new house is never occupied. They are not the people that we can trick or treat with anymore. And so that experience that like our neighborhoods are changing is something I often try to connect people with to say, is the neighborhood changing significantly? They're like, well, yes, and I don't like it. I'm like, okay, do you want it to become even more exclusive and expensive? Just a country club with fewer opportunities for people, no young kids, like kind of paint the dystopian future of like, hey, like nobody's gonna be able to like cut your hair or do any of the things that you need because they can't afford to live here. Even though, what's remarkable is how people still scrap together and try to figure it out. But trying to get them to say, is there anything that you would consider to make your community more inclusive or capable of being more diverse? Even going so far as to say, like, on the one hand, as we do this, your home value, if you change nothing about your home, just the surrounding factors of densifying the community will improve your land value. So if that's your primary thing, hey, I don't want my house price to go down, and I heard, in some city that, when they allowed more density, that all of a sudden, like, everybody's house prices fell through the roof or fell through the floor. One, that's not happened. Like, there might be very, very rare incidences where like the primary reason is because the mill closed. Like, that will have an effect. But the idea that infinite demand is also, I think, a little bit flattering of Santa Barbara. Like, it's great, but it's not that great. And if it is a question of where does smart money go, smart money goes where there's the 10x multiple or the 20x multiple. How do you head that off? You actually, just by beginning to change some of your economic conditions, by actually bringing down some of your costs for development, those types of things, actually begins to increase some of the housing supply. It means that they may say for a while, we're investing, but then after a while, the law of diminishing return says, I can go make money in a captured environment and I can do better over there. So I'm gonna go to whatever state refuses to take action on this. As well, you want to see things like parking changes. The idea that your city is not full, it's just full of cars, is I think something that like hopefully people will kind of resonate with, even as they fight for State Street to be opened up. But they're just grappling with that. But that can be trying to identify, is there anything in their lived experience where they've experienced places that have more density than Santa Barbara, and yet actually places that were quieter, more serene. And a key part of that is traffic noise being a key factor. Yeah, it's a great question. So he's asking which are the key sort of steps to aggressively advocate for. One is parking minimums. The science behind the parking standards in our communities is really weak as it relates to municipal requirements of parking. I always say there is always going to be a market requirement for parking, but that will vary on a lot by lot, site by site basis. And our parking standards don't account for that. Our parking standards have so little nuance. They might carve it up into like 18 different categories, but there are thousands of different sites in the community and they do not account for what's there. So stressing that like we need to really make movement on that, because parking minimums is a key reason why many projects have to be larger than they otherwise would be. It also assumes a certain level of, if you're putting in $62,000 for an underground parking space, then you are tacking that on and you're assuming that your target audience is going to be buying that. And then another key part of it is ensuring that the community is doing what it can to remove like a lot of the discretionary review. One of the things that our cities love to do is pride themselves on like, we provide customer service. We push back hard against that idea of like, do your customer service, have like a really great clerk at the planning counter and a really like, make sure you have Oreos at the planning meeting when you review their project. No Oreos, well, you have the clerk, but have her, she can be, cranky and he can be, a grouch. It doesn't matter because what they need is fair service and critically, most often, by right service. So that when you submit your application, you have all of the standards laid out. And so long as you can say, I meet all of them, you're not going to a further committee review. You're not doing another round for affordable housing, subsidized housing, for all of these things. It is such a difference of, do you meet fire code? That should not involve having to go chat with the fire chief as to whether or not their truck can navigate your little alleyway that you've provided for them. If there's a standard, they meet the standard. If not, and this is where we would say, don't err on the side of like shirking on safety responsibilities, but so many of the other things, design reviews, does it, there's just so many other elements of like my city where they were approved, it was zoned already for apartments. The city said, we want to meet with you. So the developer goes in, they said, can you bring along your structural engineer? So the structural engineer goes in, and they said, we actually kind of don't want apartments, we want it to be townhouses. Can you do that? It's like, well, I've got to go back to my, it's approved for one. Why are we having this discussion? And they were like, well, it's part of our long-range vision, da, 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 da. And it was like, no, you are actively stifling the types of things. And by doing that, now all of a sudden he knew that he would not be able to bring an apartment forward, even though it was zoned for that. That happens in reverse all the time as well. But that is a key part. So if you can remove some of that discretionary thing of, hey, isn't it great that our planning director can make the call? Actually, no, it should have been so clear up front, whether it was a yes or a no. That's another key part of it, is that there's an effort to be like really like, we want to just serve you. We want to like, each project is bespoke. Actually, we're just trying to put people in the homes and make that available. And yes. Oh, we're at our, okay. Yes. Oh yeah, last question, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm kind of interested to hear more about the incremental developer organization. Because
yeah, so the Incremental Development Alliance was created by a crew of John Anderson, Monty, or Monty Anderson, John Anderson as well? Maybe. They might, but a number of others. They were mainly down in the southern states, but they basically said, hey, we've developed a couple of small projects ourselves. We've learned the ropes. Now we want to pass this on. They do small-scale development boot camps. Some cities and economic development agencies will actually bring them in and have them work with a cohort of 18 or 20 local developers in the community. They will help them do like the pro forma. In some cases, they will say like, hey, 4 of you go in on a site and build 4 cottages on that site. Work together, make the project parcel. They also help you walk through like, how do you get people to buy into your projects? How do you get community investors? If you go to the Strong Towns Academy, so we have, there's a whole course that was put together by them, an introduction to incremental development. There's also a 12 steps to town making course. That is through Neighborhood Evolution, which is Monty's work, that is a tie-in with that. So check the Strong Towns website. If you do a search for incremental development, that'll show up there. With that, we're gonna do a walk on State Street if anybody is not exhausted and not wanting to simply go and buy a house. And so if you are ready, make sure you close up your tabs or stay for trivia. Trivia is about to get going, but thank you all. This is great.